For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in this place acknowledging that we stand on the territory of the Algonquin Nation, Anishinabe Nation, unceded, and, well, essentially this building sits on Algonquin land. To them I say meegwetch. I'm very pleased that we have seen another incarnation of Bill C-20. The fundamental essence of this legislation, for those who may just be joining debate, is to ensure that two really significant federal law enforcement agencies have mechanisms for civilian complaint. Les deux agences, pour évidemment, nous avons.
There are two agencies, the RCMP and the CBSA.
Services agencies and the RCMP interact with Canadians and foreigners on a regular basis. The RCMP has had a public complaints commission for many years. It has been inadequate. It has not had, initially didn't have powers to subpoena, to find out from RCMP officers what really happened in any event. The ability to call witnesses, to summon witnesses is terribly important. Les pouvoirs dont l'Agence pour la Commission publique.
The powers of that review commission for complaints against the RCMP, those powers are fairly weak. But it is remarkable that we don't have any kind of mechanism for CBSA complaints.
Has never had any mechanism for anyone to raise a complaint or concern. I don't know about others of my colleagues in this place, but certainly through COVID, we had a lot of reasons to be concerned about the structure of the Canadian Border Services Agency and the degree of powers granted to individual officers. It will be beyond the scope of this Act to deal with some of these issues, so I just place them before us now as we go through second reading debate. I think it's concerning for all of us. I shouldn't speak for all my colleagues, but I have a hunch because I talked to many, regardless of party, during the period of time that we were trying to help Canadians come home to Canada. If you were, for instance, married to a permanent resident, not a Canadian citizen, you had to make your pitch at the border to a Canadian Border Services agent whose decision was final and whose decision was discretionary to that particular officer. This created no end of misery for Canadian families, and much of it, I do know that Cabinet at the time passed another order in Council to try to alleviate the problem. But the idea that an individual officer, and this is still the case, an individual officer can make a decision on the spot about anyone. My stepdaughter once was going into the United States to take up a new job that she had in California. She had all her paperwork, but the Canadian Border Services agent didn't like her. She just said, nope, I don't believe you. I don't think you have a job. Back you go. There's no appeal. There's no place to go with that. We need to take a broader look at the Canadian Border Services Agency. One of my, it wasn't my constituent, but they asked me for help. They happened to be a couple I know from Cape Breton Island, where my family lives, and I'm from Cape Breton. The couple came to the border at the New Brunswick border with Maine, and they drove through up to the Canadian kiosk to say, "Here we are. We're coming home." And they said to the wife, "Well, you can come home, you're Canadian, but your husband can't come home, he's still a permanent resident." So they actually drove through. They had to leave one spouse at the border with all their luggage while the other was allowed into Canada because they weren't allowed to go back into the U.S. together. I mean, these kinds of things are nonsensical, and there has been, I think we need to actually look at Canadian Border Services Agency and make some policy choices and raise some other issues. We certainly know that we want, as a matter of policy, and I've heard this from many people in this House today, that we want the CBSA focused on stopping the smuggling of guns. We want the CBSA focused on the smuggling of contraband drugs. We don't particularly want the CBSA at the border to terrorize racialized people from other countries. We don't want them thinking their number one job is to find people whose citizenship is not quite right, whose paperwork as a permanent resident is not quite right, and get them deported as quickly as possible. So, yes, we have a lot of complaints about CBSA, and there are concerns about racial profiling in the RCMP. There are complaints that need to be heard. But I really want to emphasize the extent to which the CBSA in the past has brutalized Canadians. I'll give you one example because it comes from my own experience. I was just discussing it with a member of Parliament in whose riding it happened before he was the MP from Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. An Indigenous man born in the state of California, Indigenous, came across the border in the 1980s, maybe 70s, 1970s, with an Indigenous woman from Penelakut Island, from the Penelakut Nation of Vancouver Island. They married, they had kids, they had grandkids. There is a thing called the Jay Treaty, but obviously the CBSA had never heard of it, that gives additional rights to Indigenous peoples crossing borders. In any case, for some reason, they decided, and this was in 2013, to show up at the door of Richard Germain from Penelakut Island. They had not sent a note, such as we've noticed you don't seem to have all your paperwork done to be a Canadian permanent resident. They just showed up 4 days before Christmas, arrested him. I'm not exaggerating a bit. They put him in leg irons in the back of a van and drove him off Vancouver Island, the long ferry ride to Vancouver, where they placed him in a cell. I've seen the cells now because thanks to Senator Kim Pate, who likes to take other parliamentarians on tours of prisons, it's in the basement of Vancouver Airport. The people who are put there are rarely there for more than 24 hours. They are summarily deported. Since the time that I toured that facility, they've moved a different facility for deportation of foreigners. But this was a railroading. This was fast. This was taking someone from his home as a grandfather right before Christmas in front of his wife, who was a residential school survivor, and taking him for deportation without due process because, well, that was what the political mood wanted to do. We really do desperately need this legislation. I will be supporting it to get it through second reading and get it to committee, Mr. Speaker. It's the CBSA for a long time has had a high level of complaints. These have been noted by the Auditor General, complaints of racism, homophobia, transphobia, rudeness. It's an agency that desperately needs oversight. Now, I want to make sure that as other speakers have said, there are wonderful agents in the RCMP, wonderful agents in the CBSA, but this is crying out for reform. I will be presenting amendments on Bill C-20 because I want to make sure it's as rigorous as possible, as fair as possible to people who experience these issues at the border with CBSA. We also need to do much more to examine systemic racism within the RCMP. We need to do much more to pay attention to, and what if people don't feel they can actually make a complaint? We need proactive programs that are anti-racism programs in the RCMP, and we need to take a very, very close look at so-called wellness checks, which end up, and as in the case of Rodney Levi, who was a member of the Mi'kmaq Maliseet Passamaquoddy Nation, who in June 2020 was killed by an RCMP officer. Local complaint commissions, efforts at inquiries and coroner's reports are really where you don't want to start the efforts to ensure this doesn't happen again. The place to start efforts to ensure it doesn't happen again is specific anti-racism training, specific training to root out misogyny within the RCMP or the CBSA, and ensure that the agencies that are created to protect us, that we protect them, that we take steps to ensure that our RCMP and CBSA agents are protected themselves, and we need to make sure that this process set up under Bill C-20 is robust and fair and does its best to ensure that our law enforcement agencies meet our values as Canadians. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Victoria.
I want to thank the member for her speech and also congratulate her on her reelection as leader of the Green Party. And I'm wondering if she could comment on the importance of this legislation and in strengthening this legislation, especially when it comes to the kind of spying and illegal spying against law-abiding protesters. I'm thinking right now of, Enbridge and the Northern Gateway pipeline projects, especially when it comes to First Nations activists. And also, the CRCC released a report after being sued by the BC CLA on the Mounties' use of arbitrary searches and broad exclusion zones when it came to Mi'kmaq protesters doing anti-fracking standoffs in New Brunswick. I'd love to hear her thoughts.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I really appreciate the Honourable Member for Victoria remembering the Elsipogtog standoff in New Brunswick. It was a nonviolent protest. It's demonstrated in many ways to be a nonviolent protest. And it was also widely supported. The Indigenous land defenders of Elsipogtog, a part of the larger Mi'kmaq Maliseet and Passamaquoddy Nation, were widely supported by settler culture New Brunswick residents nearby. There were people on the side of the road supporting the Elsipogtog Nation. The Elsipogtog Nation was letting emergency vehicles through. They were there to protect their land against the drilling for hydraulic drilling for what is called fracking. And the response, when the RCMP the night before had brought the nonviolent protesters tobacco, a suggestion that we were now in a stage for de-escalation and working together, only to have a pre-dawn raid the next morning that involved attack dogs, fully armed, like a SWAT team moving in. Those kinds of incidents leave a community traumatized. They should leave settler culture Canadians ashamed. And the incident was never explored. There were no answers given to anyone as to why the RCMP chose an aggressive, violent approach to shut down that particular effort to ban fracking. Fortunately, the government elected right after that event banned fracking in New Brunswick. The current government is wobbly on the point, but I see my time is up.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know that in her speech, the member from Saanich Gulf Islands spoke about the experience that her stepdaughter had when entering the States. And the reality is that these various different experiences are so arbitrary and can be different depending on the person. They can be different depending on the circumstance. They can be different depending on just about any variable. And I'm wondering if she can comment on how she sees the setup of this structure as being something that would be beneficial in order for an individual like her daughter-in-law to have somewhere to go to file a proper grievance or complaint.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I remember for Kingston and the Islands. She was my stepdaughter, and it was a real blow because you have the job all set up, and some arbitrary guy decides, nope, we're not letting you fulfill your life's dreams. It's my decision, and there's no appeal. So obviously having an appeal will help, but so too will really examining the day-to-day operations of CBSA and providing more guidance. For instance, an officer shouldn't have full discretion to decide by whether they like the cut of someone's jib, whether they're coming into Canada or not. They should have some criteria. And if the criteria haven't been met, well, then they have a reason to say no. But if there are no criteria, and it's often as subjective as that, just as the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands suggested, it's arbitrary, and it's discretionary, and it's specific to each officer. So I certainly have had the experience of my constituents having completely different experiences at different airports with different CBSA officers on the same fact set, completely different decisions. So I do urge the ministers responsible, as we get Bill C-20 through, and I know it will be outside the scope of the Act, to say, and also CBSA officers should not have unfettered discretion to make decisions that affect people's lives as fundamentally as they do.
Time for a little interaction. The Honourable Member for Barrie, Springwater, Oromadante.
Thank you, Speaker. I'll make it quick. To the member opposite, thank you for your words. I was listening I was not around when this was brought up twice past. Bill C-98 and Bill C-3 have both come up in the 42nd and 43rd Parliaments. They didn't come through. They both died on the order paper. Perhaps she could share some of her wisdom as to why she feels perhaps these didn't make it through. And here we are again debating pretty similar legislation for the third time.
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thanks, my friend from Barrie, Springwater, Order-Medonte. I think that the government of the day, which happens to be the same government of the day, brought forward the legislation without a real commitment to see it through. Came through, dies on when legislation dies on the order paper. Sometimes it's inevitable, but in this case, we've been debating this. We've been calling for change. As I said earlier in a question to another colleague, I remember raising this in Parliament when the minister responsible was Ralph Goodale as Public Safety Minister. It wasn't that long ago, but this has been coming up for at least 7 years of deep concern that we need an oversight body for an agency with the powers that CBSA has. And I hope that this time, and the honourable member is a member of the official opposition, I hope that we can band together from all parties and say, we cannot let this situation go on. This time, let's get it over the finish line and make sure it's good law.